Okay, so have you ever had like that feeling where um, you know what needs to be done, right? You have the knowledge, you know what to do,
Yeah.
but somehow it just doesn't quite go right in the execution part?
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
It's kind of a frustrating part of the human experience, isn't it?
it is, and I think it's also something that's increasingly becoming a problem um, as the world is getting more complex.
Right.
We have more information coming at us,
Absolutely.
kind of a higher volume of tasks and responsibilities in a lot of cases.
Exactly.
And so that gap between what we know and what we do or what we're able to do seems to be increasing for a lot of people.
That's a really interesting way to put it. And today we're going to be diving into this disconnect. And it's something that Atul Gawande calls ineptitude in his book, The Checklist Manifesto.
Right.
And so we're going to kind of unpack this a little bit because, we all understand what ignorance is, right?
Yeah.
Ignorance is just not knowing enough, but ineptitude is a little bit different.
Yeah.
It's the failure to apply the knowledge that we already have.
Yeah, it's a little bit like you said, a disconnect.
Yeah.
Right.
And so this is going to be the puzzle that we tackle today in this deep dive. How do we actually bridge that gap between what we know and what we're able to actually do?
Yeah, and it's a tricky thing because it's not just about getting smarter or
Right.
acquiring more information in a lot of cases.
Right.
It's something different than that. So we need some other tools to.
Absolutely. And to kind of kick things off, the insights that we're going to be sharing today come directly from Atul Gawande's The Checklist Manifesto. And the central idea, as you might guess, is about checklists.
Right.
And so it might sound simple, like, okay, checklists, right? We can all make a to-do list. But there's actually a lot more to this idea than you might think.
There is, and it's interesting you say it seems simple because I think there's a reason why this book has had such a big impact.
Right.
Is that it is kind of simple and elegant,
Right.
but also really powerful. And we'll see that through the examples that we talked about today. But at its core, the idea is that simple checklists can dramatically improve our performance and reduce errors in a whole variety of fields.
Yeah.
Not just remembering what groceries to buy or
Right.
things like that, which I'm sure we all use checklists for already, but something much more profound than that.
Right. And it's not just about, jotting things down. It's really a fundamental shift in the way that we think about approaching complex tasks.
Yeah, it is. I think the idea here is acknowledging that we as humans have limitations.
Right.
Our memories are not perfect. We can't always pay attention to everything.
Absolutely.
And so a checklist is almost a way to kind of compensate for some of those limitations and free up our minds to focus on other things.
Yeah, to kind of take some of that mental load off so that we can focus on the things that are actually important, that require creativity and problem solving.
Exactly.
And so to kind of illustrate this point about how powerful checklists can be, I think it's a good idea to kind of start with a really compelling early example from the book that Gawande shares.
Yeah.
And this one really kind of highlights the core problem that we're talking about.
Okay, so are you thinking about the story of the Boeing Model 299?
Yeah, the Model 299. Go on, tell me about that.
Yeah, so this was back in 1935. Boeing developed this really advanced long-range bomber, this Model 299, which would later become the B-17.
Yeah.
But in its early days, it was a remarkable plane. It was technically superior in almost every way to the aircraft of that era.
Wow.
But during a crucial evaluation trial, it crashed, and it was a big setback, obviously, for the project.
Right.
But what was interesting was that the subsequent investigation, they really dug deep to try to find out why did this plane crash, and what they found was really surprising.
Yeah.
It wasn't a lack of pilot skill, because the pilot was highly experienced, and it wasn't really a mechanical failure in the plane itself.
Right.
It was something different. It turned out that the pilot was actually overwhelmed by the complexity of the airplane.
So the plane was just too complicated for a pilot to fly at that time.
Yeah, there was so many new procedures, so many new controls, and in the high-pressure environment of takeoff,
Right.
the pilot simply missed a critical step, and this one misstep was releasing a control lock,
Oh, wow.
and that one oversight had fatal consequences.
So basically the pilot knew how to fly, but there was just too many things to remember in that high-pressure environment, and that led to the error.
Exactly, and there was actually a newspaper headline at the time that said, too much airplane for one man to fly.
Wow.
So it really kind of captured that sentiment that the plane had become so advanced that it had exceeded the pilot's ability to manage all of those different systems.
Right. So this is like a textbook definition of what ineptitude is, right?
Right.
The pilot had the knowledge, he knew how to fly, he knew the procedures in theory, but the sheer number of those procedures led to a failure to apply that knowledge correctly.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting about this story is what happened next.
Right,
So rather than giving up on the project because the plane was so promising,
right.
the Boeing test pilots, they came up with a surprisingly simple solution.
Okay.
They created a pilot's checklist.
Oh, wow. So that's how the pilot's checklist was born out of that.
It was born out of this need to manage the complexity of this increasingly sophisticated aircraft.
Right.
And so this checklist, it covered all the essential pre-flight procedures. So takeoff, flight landing, taxiing, everything.
Wow.
And the outcome was remarkable. So with this checklist in place, the redesigned Model 299, which, as I mentioned earlier, went on to become the B-17 Flying Fortress, flew 1.8 million miles
Wow.
without a single accident.
That's incredible.
And it became one of the most crucial aircraft in World War II.
Yeah.
So it's a really powerful early demonstration of how a simple checklist can have profound implications, particularly in these high-stakes environments, where the consequences of errors can be catastrophic.
Yeah, that's such a great example, and it really sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about in this deep dive.
Exactly.
So we're going to be looking at how checklists can be used to address our inherent human fallibility, right?
Right.
How can we actually use these simple tools to overcome these limitations that we have as humans?
Exactly.
And we're going to look at examples from various fields.
Yeah.
Obviously, medicine is a big one, but also construction, and as you alluded to earlier, even the world of rock and roll.
Yeah, we'll get to that. That's one of my favorite stories in the book, actually,
Yeah.
the Van Halen story. But yeah, it's really fascinating to see how this principle of checklists has been applied in so many different areas.
Right. It's really about unpacking the principles behind this.
Yeah.
Because as we said, it's not just about writing things down.
Right.
It's a completely different way of thinking about how to manage complex situations.
It is. It's a way of systematizing things.
Yeah.
Right. It's a way of making sure that the critical steps don't get missed, even when we're under pressure, even when we're tired, even when we're dealing with a lot of information.
Right. And I think that's a really important part of this is that it's not about, simplifying the complex work to a point where it's, meaningless.
Right.
It's really about strategically offloading some of that cognitive burden
Yeah.
of remembering every single step
Right.
so that our brains are free to focus on the things that actually require our creative thinking and our problem-solving abilities.
Exactly. And a lot of times those steps that we want to offload with a checklist are the critical but routine things.
Right.
Like the things that we do all the time and we think, "Oh yeah, I got that. I know how to do that." But it's precisely those things that can sometimes slip through the cracks when we're not paying attention.
Yes, absolutely. And so let's kind of dig into this problem a little bit deeper, this problem of human error, right?
Okay.
Why is it that even when we have all this knowledge and expertise, we're still susceptible to making mistakes?
Yeah, so the book illustrates this problem really well with an example from the intensive care unit, so the ICU.
Yeah.
And they talk about a study that was done in Israel where they found that the average patient in the ICU requires 178 distinct actions per day from the medical staff.
Wow, that's a lot.
It's a lot, right? It's everything from administering medication to checking vital signs to adjusting equipment, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine that even with the best training and the best intentions,
Right.
there's a lot of room for error there when you have that many different things to keep track of.
Right. So just the sheer volume of things that you have to remember and execute on is a recipe for potential errors.
Exactly. And so let's say, to the sake of argument, that the medical staff in this ICU operate with a 99% accuracy rate,
Okay, that sounds pretty good.
which is a very high accuracy rate.
Yeah.
But when you do the math, 1% error rate across 178 actions per day translates to roughly 2 errors per patient per day.
Oh, wow.
And so you can see how those errors can start to add up. And in the high-stakes context of an ICU, those errors can quickly become life-threatening.
Yeah, that's a pretty sobering thought.
It is, and I think it really highlights the point that even when you have highly trained professionals working in a very controlled environment,
Right.
the sheer volume of tasks can really create a significant opportunity for things to go wrong.
Right. And that really applies, I think, to so many different areas of life. It's not just specific to, healthcare or the ICM or something like that.
Absolutely.
It's really about any field where you have a lot of complexity and a lot of things that you have to keep track of.
Exactly. And even in areas where we feel like we have expertise and we're really comfortable,
Yeah.
the more steps that are involved in a process, the more vulnerable we are to overlooking something.
Right.
Right? And it might be something small, it might seem obvious in hindsight,
Yeah.
but those small errors can have a big impact down the line.
Absolutely. And so I think this is where the concept of checklists being a cognitive net really comes into play.
It is a great analogy, and I think that's one of the strengths of this book, is that Gawande uses really vivid language to explain these concepts.
Yeah.
And so this idea of a cognitive net it's basically saying that checklists can act as a safety mechanism to catch those errors that our memory might miss.
Yeah.
Particularly when we're under pressure, or when we're distracted, or when we're just doing things routinely and we're not really paying attention.
Right. Like when you leave the house and you think, did I lock the door? It's
Right,
such a routine thing, but sometimes you just can't remember if you actually did it or not.
Right, and most of the time we probably did lock the door.
Right.
But it's that little seed of doubt that creeps in, and a checklist can really eliminate that doubt.
Right. And so it's really about, creating that reliability even for these seemingly simple tasks.
Exactly. And I think the takeaway here is that, we're not always going to be at our best.
Right.
We're going to have days where we're tired, or we're stressed, or we're distracted. And checklists are a way to kind of compensate for that and make sure that the critical steps don't get missed.
Right. They're almost like a backup system for our brains.
Exactly.
To ensure that we don't, make those silly mistakes that can have big consequences.
Yeah, and I think the key thing is to identify those areas in our lives where checklists can be most helpful.
Okay, let's look at how checklists have been applied in the medical field.
Okay.
Because the book provides a lot of really powerful examples of how they've been used to improve patient safety and outcomes.
It does.
And I think one of the most compelling stories is the work of Peter Bonnevost at Johns Hopkins Hospital back in the early 2000s.
Yes.
And he really focused on a very specific issue, which was central line infections in the ICU.
Right.
Now, can you explain to us what the central line infections are?
Yeah, so a central line is basically a catheter that's inserted into a large vein,
Okay.
typically in the neck or the chest, and it's used to deliver fluids or medications or to monitor a patient's vital signs.
Right.
But because it's a direct line into the bloodstream, there's a risk of infection.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so central line infections can be very serious.
Right.
They can lead to sepsis, which is a life-threatening condition.
Wow.
So they're a big concern in hospitals, especially in ICUs.
And so Pronovost wanted to tackle this problem.
He did, and it's interesting because his solution wasn't some kind of high-tech gadget.
Right.
Or, a radical new medical procedure.
Right. It wasn't like some new groundbreaking discovery or something like that.
No, it was actually very simple. He developed a 5-step checklist for doctors to use when they were inserting central lines.
Okay.
And these steps were all things that were already known to be best practices.
So things that doctors were already supposed to be doing, but they weren't necessarily doing them consistently?
Exactly right. It was things like washing their hands thoroughly,
Right.
wearing a sterile mask and gown, cleaning the patient's skin with antiseptic and things like that.
Right. Basic hygiene procedures.
Yeah.
But just making sure that they were followed every single time.
Right. And so the checklist wasn't really about introducing new knowledge.
Right.
It was about making sure that the existing knowledge was applied consistently.
Yeah, that's such a key point.
Yeah, and there was one really innovative aspect of Protovost's checklist, which was that he empowered nurses to stop doctors if they saw them skipping a step.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So it wasn't just a passive checklist. It was actually giving someone the authority to enforce it.
Right, it was giving the nurses a voice.
Yeah.
And this was significant because traditionally in hospitals, there's a very clear hierarchy.
Right.
Right, the doctor's at the top and the nurses are kind of subordinate to the doctors.
Yeah.
But Protovost recognized that in order for this checklist to be effective, everyone needed to be on board.
Right.
And the nurses were often in a better position to observe whether the steps were being followed or not.
Yeah, because they're right there with the patient the whole time.
Exactly.
Observing what's going on.
And so by empowering the nurses to speak up, he created a system of checks and balances
Right.
that helped to ensure that the checklist was being used properly.
Yeah, that's really smart. And I imagine that might have been met with some pushback initially.
Yeah, you're right. There was definitely some resistance at first.
Especially in the surgeons.
Yeah, some of the doctors felt like it was an insult to their intelligence.
Right.
Or that it was slowing them down, but the results were undeniable.
Yeah.
Within a year, the infection rate in that ICU at Johns Hopkins plummeted from 11% to zero. Zero, which is an incredible improvement
That's remarkable.
for such a simple intervention.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that sometimes the biggest gains come from just doing the basic things, right?
Exactly. It's not always about, coming up with the next big breakthrough.
Right?
Sometimes it's just about making sure that we're doing the things that we already know we should be doing.
Consistently.
Yeah, consistently and reliably.
And that's really what checklists help us to do.
Right, they take the guesswork out of it.
Yeah.
They give us a clear set of steps to follow so that we don't have to rely on our memory or our judgment in those critical moments.
Right. And this example really illustrates that point beautifully.
It does, and it really kind of changed the way people thought about checklists in healthcare.
Right.
Because before this, checklists were seen as something that you might use for, routine tasks,
Yeah.
but not necessarily for something as complex and as high stakes as surgery or intensive care.
Right.
But Pronovost's work showed that checklists could actually be very effective in those environments.
Right. And this wasn't just a one-off success story.
Right.
Pronovost actually went on to implement more checklists within the ICU,
He did.
and with similar positive outcomes.
Yeah, he was really a pioneer in this area, and he really helped to kind of pave the way for the wider adoption of checklists in healthcare.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, as you mentioned earlier, there was some resistance to this idea,
Right.
especially from experienced surgeons who felt that, they were above using a checklist.
Yeah, I think there's a certain ego that comes with being an expert.
Right.
And sometimes it's hard to admit that you might need help or that you might make mistakes.
Right.
But the reality is that everyone makes mistakes.
Everyone.
Even the best and the brightest and the most experienced.
Right.
And so checklists are a way to kind of acknowledge that fallibility
Yeah.
and to put safeguards in place to prevent those mistakes from happening.
Right. And it's not about saying that, the surgeons aren't good at their job.
Right.
It's just saying that everyone can benefit from having a little bit of extra support.
Exactly. It's like having a second set of eyes,
Yeah.
right? Just to make sure that you haven't missed anything.
And that's really what checklists provide, is that extra layer of safety. And I think a great example of this is the Keystone Initiative that happened in the state of Michigan,
Yes.
starting in Detroit with Sinai Grace Hospital.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about that program?
Yeah, so this was a few years after Protovost's initial work at Johns Hopkins.
Okay.
And he was given the opportunity to kind of scale up his approach
Right.
and internet it across a much larger system of hospitals.
Yeah.
And so the Keystone Initiative was a collaboration between the Michigan Health and Hospital Association
Okay.
and a number of different hospitals in the state. And the goal was to reduce central line infections across the board.
Right.
And Sinai Grace was one of the hospitals that participated in this initiative.
Yeah. And this hospital in particular was facing a lot of challenges.
It was a large hospital in Detroit
Yeah.
that was facing significant financial challenges.
Right.
Staff morale was low, and they had very high rates of central line infections.
Right. So it was a really tough situation.
It was, but Pronovost and his team, they went in and they worked with the staff at Sinai Grace to implement these checklist-based protocols.
Right.
And the results were really remarkable.
Yeah.
Within a matter of months, they saw a dramatic reduction in central line infections.
Wow.
And the initiative as a whole is credited with saving an estimated 1,500 lives.
1,500 lives.
Yeah, and saving the healthcare system around $175 million.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and so it was a really powerful demonstration of how these simple checklists
Yeah.
can have a huge impact on a large scale.
Right. And I think this is where the book's categorization of different types of problems comes in.
Right.
Because Gawande talks about, simple problems, complicated problems, and complex problems.
He does.
And it's helpful to kind of think about where checklists are most effective.
Right.
And so simple problems are things like, baking a cake.
Right.
Where the steps are pretty clear and repeatable.
You follow the recipe and it works out.
Right.
Hopefully.
Complicated problems are things like launching a rocket,
Yeah.
where there's a lot of interconnected parts,
Right.
a lot of different teams involved.
It's rocket science, literally.
Right, but there's still a well-defined set of procedures
Right.
that if you follow them correctly, you should get the desired outcome.
Right.
And then there's complex problems like raising a child, where there's just so much variability
Right.
and unpredictability, and it's hard to know what the outcome is going to be.
You can't just follow a checklist and expect to raise a perfect child.
Right, and so the question is, are checklists only effective for those simple problems?
Right.
Or can they also be used for more complicated and even complex problems?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the book provides some really interesting insights into that.
Yeah.
And one of the examples that they use is the construction industry,
Okay.
which I think is fascinating because the construction industry has been using checklists in various forms for much longer than the medical field.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so if you think about it, building a skyscraper is not a simple problem.
Definitely not.
It's a highly complex undertaking that involves massive amounts of knowledge,
Right.
specialized expertise,
Yeah.
intricate planning and coordination between a lot of different teams.
Yeah, it's a logistical nightmare.
It is, but it's something that we do remarkably well as humans.
We do.
And one of the reasons why we're able to do it so well is because we've developed systems
Right.
and tools to help us manage that complexity. And one of the most important tools is the checklist.
Okay, so tell me about some of the checklists that they use in construction.
So there's two main types of checklists that they use.
Okay.
One is the construction schedule,
Right.
and this is basically a master timeline
Yeah.
that outlines every single sub-project,
Right.
their dependencies,
Yeah.
and the overall timeline for completion.
Right. So it's making sure that everything happens in the right order.
Exactly. It's a way of orchestrating this incredibly complex process
Yeah.
and making sure that all the different pieces come together at the right time.
Right. And so this construction schedule is essentially a giant checklist.
Yeah, it's a checklist of tasks, but it's also a checklist of communication
Yeah.
because it specifies who needs to talk to whom,
Right.
and in order to make sure that everyone is on the same page.
Yeah, that's so important in a project like that where there's so many different people involved.
Exactly. And so this construction schedule, it leverages the knowledge of all the different engineers and architects and contractors
Right.
who are working on the project.
Right.
And it brings it all together into one centralized document.
Right. So it's not just one person trying to keep track of everything in their head.
Right.
It's a shared system that everyone can refer to.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so powerful.
Yeah. And then the second type of checklist that they use in construction is the submittal schedule.
Right.
Now, this one's a little bit different.
It is.
It's not a checklist of tasks, but a checklist of communication.
Right. It's more about making sure that the right information is flowing between the different teams at the right time.
Okay.
So, for example, if the architects make a change to the design,
Yeah.
the submittal schedule will specify when that information needs to be communicated to the structural engineers
Right.
and to the contractors and so on.
Right.
And this helps to prevent errors and delays.
Right, because if the information isn't flowing properly, then you're going to have people working at cross purposes.
Exactly.
And that's just a recipe for disaster.
It is. And so the submittal schedule is really about coordinating that communication
Yeah.
and making sure that everyone is working from the same set of information.
Right, and what's amazing is that these systems were in place long before computers and sophisticated software.
Right.
So it really speaks to the fundamental value of this systematic approach.
It does. It shows that even in the absence of technology,
Yeah.
humans have recognized the need for checklists
Right.
to manage complex tasks.
Absolutely. And so this brings us to the story of Van Halen and their infamous no brown M&Ms clause in their concert writer.
Right.
Now, on the surface, this seems like just rock star excess.
Yeah, it does.
But as we'll see, there's actually a very intelligent reason behind it.
There is.
So can you tell us the story?
Yeah, so Van Halen was known for having this very elaborate concert rider,
Yeah.
which is basically a list of demands that they would give to the venues where they were performing.
Right.
And this rider was very detailed.
Yeah.
It specified everything from the type of food and drinks they wanted backstage
Okay.
to the technical specifications of the stage and the lighting and the sound system.
Right.
And buried deep within this rider was a clause that said there must be bowls of M&M candies backstage, but with absolutely no brown M&Ms.
Right.
And if brown M&Ms were found, the band had the right to cancel the concert
And still get paid.
and still get paid in full.
Wow, so this was a serious clause.
It was, and for years people just assumed that this was just rock star diva behavior,
Right.
a way for the band to kind of assert their dominance
Yeah.
and make sure that they were treated like royalty.
Right.
But as David Lee Roth, the lead singer of Van Halen, later explained, there was actually a much more practical reason behind this clause.
Okay.
He said that it was a litmus test.
A litmus test.
Yeah, to make sure that the local promoters were actually paying attention
To the right.
to the rider and to the technical specifications in particular.
Okay.
Because Van Halen's concerts were very complex productions.
Right.
They had a lot of heavy equipment, a
Yeah.
lot of pyrotechnics,
Right.
and so on.
Yeah, a lot of things that could go wrong.
Exactly. And so the brown M&M clause was a way for the band to quickly assess
Right.
whether the promoters were actually taking the time to read the rider carefully
Okay.
and to follow the instructions.
So if they found brown M&Ms, it was a sign that the promoters might have overlooked other more important details?
Exactly right. And Roth actually gave an example of this in his autobiography.
Oh, really?
He said that there was one time where they were performing in Colorado
Yeah.
and they found brown M&Ms backstage. And so they did a thorough inspection of the venue, and they found that the promoters had ignored the weight requirements for the stage.
Oh, no.
And this was a serious safety hazard,
Yeah.
because if the stage had collapsed, it could have injured or killed people.
Yeah, that's a serious situation.
Yeah, and so Roth said that the brown M&M clause had actually saved lives.
Wow, so it wasn't just about, being picky or demanding.
Right.
It was actually about safety.
Yeah, it was a clever way to kind of test the waters and
Right.
make sure that the promoters were taking their job seriously.
Yeah. So it was a checklist in
It
disguise.
was a very unconventional checklist,
Yeah,
but it was a checklist nonetheless.
and it worked.
And it worked.
And so this brings us to the hand washing project in Karachi, Pakistan.
Yeah,
And this is a great example of how simple interventions can have a huge impact on public health.
it is.
So tell us about this project.
Yeah, so this project took place in the slums of Karachi,
Okay.
which is one of the largest cities in the world.
Yeah.
And the goal of the project was to reduce the rates of premature deaths among young children.
Okay.
And so they were facing a lot of challenges in these slums.
Right.
Poor sanitation,
Yeah.
widespread illiteracy,
Right.
bureaucracy,
Right.
all sorts of things that were making it difficult to improve health outcomes.
Right. So it was a very complex problem
Yeah, it was a very complex problem.
with a lot of different factors at play.
Exactly. And so a health worker named Stephen Luby,
Okay.
he was working in these slums, and he was trying to figure out what was the most effective way to make a difference.
Right.
And he realized that one of the simplest and most effective things that people could do
Yeah.
was to wash their hands with soap.
Okay. So hand washing is
Something-
something that we all know we should be doing.
Right. But in these slums, soap was often scarce.
Right.
And even when people had soap, they weren't necessarily using it consistently.
Right.
And so Luby and his team, they decided to focus on promoting hand washing
Okay.
as a way to reduce the spread of disease.
Right.
And so they distributed free soap to families in the slums.
Okay.
And they also developed a simple checklist
Okay.
of 6 specific situations when people should wash their hands.
Okay. So what were those situations?
So it was things like after using the toilet,
Okay.
before preparing food,
Yeah.
before eating, after cleaning a child's bottom,
Okay.
things like that.
Right. Basic hygiene stuff,
Yeah.
but making sure that people were doing it at the key moments.
Right. And so this checklist, it was very